And now, please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, the words that Harold just read for all of us, I imagine, are words that are familiar to nearly every one of you. This is, after all, one of the most famous texts in the entire New Testament. And yet, if you can believe it, in the last 16 years of being an ordained minister, I have never once preached on this text. Now, part of that is because in the lectionary, it shows up at the last Sunday of Ordinary Time, what's often called Christ the King Sunday, and it just so happens that falls usually on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, which in the congregational tradition is a high holiday of Thanksgiving Sunday, so I've always dressed up like a pilgrim and preached on that instead. But today I do get the opportunity, the privilege to preach on this iconic text. I hope you're ready for it. As Harold described, the scene here in our text is one that occurs on Holy Week. It's among the last days of Jesus' life. It's usually placed on Wednesday evening, the day before the Last Supper and the betrayal. There Jesus is on the Mount of Olives. He can look across and see Jerusalem just over the Kidron Valley. He's there with his closest friends, giving his final speech to them. In the distance, he can see beyond the Garden of Gethsemane, the very place where he'll be arrested and betrayed. And these words, the words that Harold just read, are the final words of the final speech that Jesus gives to his disciples. Given that, it certainly is something that Jesus intends for us to pay attention to. And the story, as Harold read it, is straightforward. Jesus portrays what will happen at the end of time. And remember, he's standing on the Mount of Olives, and according to Jewish tradition, when the day of the Lord arrives, all the nations are supposed to be gathered together there on the Mount of Olives. And the nations are all gathered together, and the Son of Man, also called the King in this text, separates all people. Sheep on one side, the goats on the other. And again, there's that great litany of things. Blessed are you, you righteous ones, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat, and thirsty, something to drink, stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, you visited me. And that great response is, but Jesus, we never saw you. We never did this to you. But then the response, insofar as you did this to those who are least of those who are members of my family, you did it unto me. Now, generally in liberal churches, they cut off the text at that point. They don't want to hear the rest of it. But the rest of it's also in the text, where it's accursed are you who saw me hungry and did not give me food. You did not give me something to drink. You did not welcome me. You did not clothe me. You did not visit me. You did not care for me. And now you are going to be sent off to eternal damnation. If there's one thing you can say about this text, it certainly is intense. It makes you sit forward and pay attention. And also you pick up how radical this text is. Radical for Jesus' first listeners to this, and radical for us today. Because here's the thing. All of the people here, all of you here, I know, every single one of you is a nice person. If I were to ask people that you know, they'd be like, oh yeah, that person's awesome. And then you can say, oh, by the way, I go to the Hills Church, join me. You are all wonderful people. You care for people around you. You help your friends and family. You try and do the right thing every day. And this text is directed directly at you. Remember, this is to the disciples. They were also good people. And here Jesus calls them out. You will not be judged based on how nice you are to the people you love around you. You'll be judged on how you treat the least of those who are members of my family. In 1968 in Medellin, Colombia, there was the Second Episcopal Conference of Bishops in Latin America after the Second Vatican Council. And this 1968 Medellin conference is famous for a lot of reasons, one of which is these bishops got together and they said unequivocally that Christianity has, quote unquote, a preferential option for the poor. If you want to know who is supposed to get first place in the ways in which Christians judge things, it is those who are poor. One of the themes that comes up throughout the Gospels that Jesus says is that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. The first, those who are doing really well, those who have things going great. Yeah, you'll be at the back of the line. This is dramatically evoked if you've read Flannery O'Connor's short story Revelation, where she writes, this is right near the end of her life, O'Connor's life, and she writes about this rather self-righteous woman in the South who does everything right and then is dripping with judgment for all these other folks. And at the end of the story, she has this vision of people going to heaven and all those folks that she's been judging, all the homeless people, the dregs of society, they're all clean and they're at the front of the line. This is a radical text. Now, I know there's some of you here who are good Protestants who are like, wait a second here, this is just works righteousness. We're Protestants. The whole Reformation was to overturn that, right? I mean, before the Reformation, you had the Roman Catholic Church, or the old Roman Catholic Church, where everything was laid out, like, okay, avoid the mortal sins, check, avoid the mortal sins, trying to minimize the venial sins, you know, go to church when you go there, say your confessions, there's an appropriate number of Hail Marys and other things you get at the end, and then check, you're all set, right? And the whole thing of the Reformation is like, no. You're saved not by works, you're saved by faith, right? Justified by faith. Especially if you grew up Lutheran. Where's David Otten? You certainly know this. That was drilled into you, David. You know? You're saved by faith. So the question is like, what's with this text? Why doesn't this seem contradictory? Well, this text is a great balance to those Christians who are like, oh, I committed myself to Christ, so I'm good. I can just check that box. Remember, in the letter of James, it's like faith without works is dead. If you have faith but you don't actually follow through on it, what kind of faith do you have? Even Paul, the person who we get this whole salvation through faith from, when he is commissioned by Peter and James in the beginning of Galatians, Peter and James say one thing to him. They said, and be sure to remember the poor. That was their one admonition to Paul. And then Paul responds, of course, it's something I was eager to do. But sometimes these messages are tough. I remember years ago I was in Houston, and a friend of mine, Jim, had a really fancy Christmas party. And we had just met, and he asked me to give like an opening blessing at his Christmas party. And there were like 250 people there, and all very conservative. This is deep red Houston. And all very conservative Christians. And I get up and I give a blessing based on Luke and how the whole story, the story of the Christmas story is, you know, Mary, she's poor, Jesus is poor, there's no place, we have to make sure to remember those who are poor and homeless. That's the core message of Christmas. And the people sitting there looked at me and they did not want to hear that message. But I think of this more than anything else, again, coming back to the context. You've always had that friend, I hope, who cares about you enough to tell you the hard truths. You've had those times where the friend pulls you aside and says, you know, I know you don't want to hear this, but. And it's done in love, even though it can be harsh to hear. That's the context here. These are people that Jesus loves. He's not saying this to judge them, to send them to damnation. He's saying to say, I love you, and so you got to hear this. Now, the folks who take this text the most seriously within the Christian world are liberation theologians. I won't quiz you on who's up on your liberation theology and who isn't. Liberation theology is a very popular, important theological movement that arose in the 20th century, starting in the 1960s in Latin America. And what liberation theologians say with this text, they say, if you want to find Jesus, you got to go to the people on the margins. That's where you find him. So if you want to do theological reflection, if you actually want to think about the faith, your first step is to go find Jesus where he is, which is on the margins, and then you work with those people, and that's how you find Jesus. You begin with life experience, with lived experience on the margins, and then you go back to the ivory tower. Liberation theologians are like, no, you don't find truth by starting in the ivory tower. No offense to some of us, like truth is not found at places like Harvard and Yale. It's found first and foremost working with people on the margins. That's where Jesus is. James Cone, who's one of the most famous theologians in the United States in the 20th century, the founder of Black liberation theology, in 1970, James Cone wrote that if you cannot see Jesus in the face of a Black American, then you don't understand Christianity. If you can't see Jesus in the face of those who are oppressed, you do not understand Christianity. So what does this mean for us? What does this mean? For starters, obviously it means this is a call to action from Jesus for all of us to engage in Christian service for those in need. Because again, it's there where we actually meet and get to know Jesus. It's amazing how your perspective can change when you can talk to people in different life experiences. I remember years ago when I was doing some tutoring at Suffolk County Prison in Boston. This particular person in jail was trying to get his GED, and I was there to help him with math tutoring. And I'll never forget this, sitting down with him and going through fractions, and he had this moment. He's like, oh, okay, this is finally making sense. And I was like, yes. And then he paused and he said, I remember back in third grade, I was in a big class, I was sitting in the back, teacher was going over this, didn't get it, so I just zoned out. I decided I was just gonna stop paying attention in school. And I remember thinking to myself, if I were in third grade and I was like struggling with fractions, my parents would have been working with me every night. They would have hired special tutors. I would have other teachers sitting down being like, come on, John, you can do it, fractions. And here's this kid who literally gave up on school in third grade. And now there, 10 years later, I was sitting next to him in prison. It's amazing how our perspective can change when we try and go meet Jesus. But the good news is, or one of the good news is, you don't need to go that far afield to find people on the margins. Let's say you're a high school student and you're at your school and you see some kid getting bullied, you see some kid being marginalized. That is an opportunity to stand up and say, I'm going to be there with you. This is Jesus there. This person needs an advocate. Within the town of Wellesley, there are lots of issues in the town of Wellesley. People who are downtrodden, people who are marginalized in one way or another, folks who suffer from mental illness. And it can be hard to see Jesus in the face of some people struggling from mental illness, particularly when you've been dealing with it for years and they're in your family. Or people struggling with addiction, how difficult that can be for people in a family. Loving folks also requires drawing boundaries, but we still need to see Jesus in the face of these folks who are suffering, and in the people who are caring for them, the family members who've been dealing with this for decades, who actually need someone to sit down and say, I'm here for you. But in addition to direct service, in addition to trying to serve others in our community and more broadly, there's also, of course, indirect service. You all are busy people doing things that are great work. I don't want to discount that one bit. But one way that we can help live into Matthew 25 is by taking Yield checkbook and writing a check. Because there are a lot of great people doing work, but they also need to put food on their tables. and they need support. And if you're lucky enough to have the capacity to be able to do that, that's one way to live into this demand that Jesus puts on us. I was so happy, and in Easter, we collected Easter offering for the Brazilian Workers Center, caring for people who are recent immigrants who literally who are at the end of their line. They have nothing. And you all were able to raise over $13,000 to directly support them. Or the money that we have that goes to Common Cathedral, or to the Outdoor Church, or to Family Promise, or to the African Indian Alliance, or to Honduras Hope, or to all these great organizations that this congregation supports, or that you support in your own life. That's a way to help. And there's another way, and this is where we're going to get in trouble. I mean, oof. Part of me thinks that I like getting in trouble sometimes. Because there's another way to help. Turns out a lot of big problems require more than just individuals. In 2003, George W. Bush, after having been lobbied by evangelical Christians, started the PEPFAR program to provide antiretroviral drugs to those suffering from HIV/AIDS in Africa. In the last 25 years, it is estimated that this government program has saved 25 million lives. 25 million lives. Your taxpayer dollars have saved 25 million lives that would not have been saved otherwise. The reality is, if you want to help those on the margins, part of that involves public policy. You want to help those who are sick? How are they going to get health insurance? That requires public policy. It should not be a situation in this country where a parent with a kid all of a sudden has to have a GoFundMe page to not go bankrupt because their child has a major surgery. That is a moral abomination in our country. That requires public policy. But here's the thing. This is one thing I've said time and again. This is not a partisan thing. My job is to lift up the Christian message and say, listen, we all need to be good moral people regardless of your political values. I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum. No matter where you fall, all of us need to care about those on the margins. There might be different approaches, but we all have to care about them. I mean, I think about, the great University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman, And Milton Friedman saying, what's been the most effective way to lift people out of abject poverty in the last 50 years? Capitalism. But unfettered capitalism also has its own evils. These issues are complex, but they require more people being engaged. And one of the things I love about being in this congregation is what this congregation can do. You come here on Sunday morning, and this is a place to meet God and get your cup filled. I mean, maybe I'm not filling your cup right now, but you get your cup filled. And then you have the energy, the spiritual energy to go out and be the person God is calling you to be as you go out into the world. You come here and you have a chance to have your faith formed and stretched and shaped in terms of theology and God and what matters in life. This is fantastic. But also we have the chance to go out into the world and actually do the Matthew 25 work in our community. That's a big part of it. And this is one of the things, too, where I'm like, I want to keep growing this church. And some people are like, I don't know if I want to grow the church. So I'm going to be sitting in the pews or take my seat in the pews. And no, we got to grow the church. Because the more people we have, the more good we can do. There are certain basic costs to keep this whole operation running. All the extras, we get to start doing cool things. Not that we're not doing cool things now, but we get to do additional cool things. We have more hands to volunteer to do the work. We can spread the message, the good news of God in so many more ways. The bigger we are, the stronger we are. One of the things I love about this church is the potential it has. I mean, again, I've said this many times. Wellesley has the social capital, the intellectual capital, and the financial capital to make a massive impact in this community. We have that opportunity. So now practically, how do we do it? First thing is at some point this week, and I include myself in this, at some point this week we need to sit down and figure out what are our priorities and how do they shake out. We have to do a little bit of personal reckoning and say, hey, are we spending our time in the best way we can? Doesn't have to be a radical change, but what sort of changes can you make? That's a between you and God thing. How can you change those priorities? And for your kids too. And I want to make sure my kids have the right values. Maybe something like church is something that's worth being a priority. Second thing that we can do in the practicality is help our Christian Service Support Board. The way our governance works in this church is that we elect leaders to serve on the Christian Service Support Board to help guide this kind of work in the community. But remember, it's a support board. And it only works with the energy of all of you as well. I'm grateful to see Elaine here in the pews visiting. Welcome, Elaine. Great to have you back. I remember talking with Elaine, who worked hard on both outreach and Christian service. And Elaine being like, well, one of the problems, John, is that there's just not enough people who are stepping up. I remember telling Elaine in that meeting, you give me the pulpit. I can try and get people to step up. So Elaine, this is a message, one of them. They're going to say, you got to help the Christian Service Support Board. They're actually meeting tonight, later today. And they need your help. And the final thing is the easiest of all. It turns out today you have an opportunity to put your faith in action. It's always good to have an altar. See, conservative churches, there's an altar call. This is my equivalent of an altar call. In your order of worship, you will find this sheet. Housed, of course, proudly within the walls of the Wellesley Hills Congregational Church is the Wellesley Food Pantry. And we have gotten word from the Wellesley Food Pantry that they are in need of more food. You go down and their shelves are empty. Some of their sources of food have been changed in recent months, and the need post-pandemic is greater than ever. There literally isn't enough food on those shelves. And so, over the next month, we will be collecting food to help be a part of restocking those shelves. We have a list of all the things that are needed on one side, and then a particular drive for each week coming up. Take this home. Go do an extra shopping trip. Jesus says to feed the hungry. This literally is feeding the hungry. Similarly, after church, people are going to be asking for volunteers for the pumpkin patch. Now, the pumpkin patch is fun. I know you all love it, and you want to do it because it's fun. It is fun. But I also want you to bear in mind the pumpkin patch, the money from those pumpkins is supporting folks who are growing it in New Mexico. Those folks need the money. The money that we get from it, half of that goes to support our youth trip going to Appalachia next spring so that we can form our youth in the exact values that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 25, and the other half goes to the Wellesley Food Pantry. Your volunteering at the pumpkin patch is part of putting your faith into action. Now, the reason why I wanted to preach this sermon today is because after all the Lisa Miller stuff, I'm like, okay, I love Lisa Miller and I love talking about spirituality and the spiritual life, but I thought to myself, there's one thing that's missing, because the Christian life is more than just about spiritual connection. It's also about following as a disciple of Jesus. It has content that's in it, and this is a core part of what that content is. So I ask you to think deeply about this passage. Take it, read it over to yourself this week. Think about what you can do, and let's make sure that we're proud to be among those sheep, among those people who are doing the corporal works of mercy, so that when our time comes, we can hear those words, "Well done, good and faithful servant."